Hi, so let's start talking about some of those functional health tests that I think are the most beneficial in uncovering healing opportunities for the body. The first one I want to talk about is testing of the HPA axis. The HPA stands for hypothalamus, pituitary, and adrenal. And in a lot of cases, the type of tests that are used to test the HPA axis are often just referred to as adrenal testing or an adrenal stress profile, but it's actually a little more comprehensive than that, especially if you choose to use one particular type of testing known as the Dutch test. But let's talk about both of the options. So the two types of tests offered are saliva testing, which is also referred to as a 4-point salivary test because you're literally giving a saliva sample at 4 specific points throughout the day. Or there's urine testing. And the most popular urine test is referred to as the Dutch Complete, and Dutch is an acronym, and it stands for Dried Urine Testing for Comprehensive Hormones. So let me just describe a little about each one of those and why one might be more appropriate over the other. So first let's talk about saliva testing. Saliva testing is pretty easy for most people to do. There may be some exceptions to that, like if someone has a really dry mouth, especially due to wearing dental appliances and things like that. But for the most part, most people would not have a problem producing enough saliva for a sample. They're just little test tubes that you literally spit into, again, at 4 specific intervals throughout the day. And the reason that you want to do it throughout the day is because when you're testing, for example, for cortisol, which is the stress hormone, or some people call it the fight or flight hormone, your body produces different amounts throughout the day. So there's a very specific pattern of cortisol, which we refer to as the circadian rhythm. By testing at those specific points, we're not only looking at what's your overall level of cortisol that's available in your saliva, it's known as the 24-hour or free cortisol, but we're looking at how much is produced at each of those intervals to check that pattern, to check for that rhythm. With the saliva testing that I can offer clients, we do test for cortisol. We also test for another hormone called DHEA, and DHEA is like a counter-regulatory hormone to cortisol. It's supposed to help keep cortisol in check. So if cortisol is elevated, typically DHEA is elevated to counteract that. And then also with the saliva test, you can test the sex hormones, so estrogen, progesterone, and testosterone. And finally, melatonin, which is a hormone that your body produces to help regulate sleep. Now, there's pros and cons, obviously, to every kind of test. And one of the pros of saliva testing is, again, it's easy. It's easy for most people to spit into little test tubes, very easy to do at home. It's also, of the two, between saliva testing or urine testing, it's the least expensive, okay? But it's the least expensive because it's also not quite as comprehensive as urine testing. And I'll talk about more about that in just a second. But saliva testing is certainly an option. It's usually somewhere around $150. And if that's something that together we feel would be a good test for you, I simply order the kit, I drop ship it to your house, you collect your saliva, and I give you more details about when you're supposed to do that if we have an appointment, but very easy to do for most people. The other test, the Dutch test, is more comprehensive. I'm not going to say it's more accurate because saliva testing is actually very accurate, especially for assessing that circadian rhythm. Because when you're giving saliva samples, for example, you shouldn't take more than about 10 minutes to fill your vial with saliva. So when that measurement of cortisol is used, it's very specific to that 10-minute interval, so it's very spot on as far as what your free unbound levels are. With urine, it's a little different. It can go back as far as 90 minutes. So you're still gonna see a circadian rhythm, you're still gonna see a pattern, but with urine testing, it's just done a little differently than saliva testing because of that. So one of the big differences with the urine testing is in addition to testing what's known as that free, unbound 24-hour measurement of like cortisol and DHEA, the sex hormones, melatonin, with urine you can also measure what are called the metabolites. And what is so useful about that? Well, there's a lot of useful things, and I'm going to try and keep this short, but it's useful in that you're not only measuring what is free and unbound and available to the tissues, but how much is actually being produced by your adrenals. So that's one thing that saliva testing can't show you that urine testing can. Now, in a person who's 100% healthy, a perfect scenario, what your adrenals are producing versus what is free and unbound and available should be about the same. But interestingly enough, in about 70% of the population, it doesn't match. And that can be very useful when you're trying to help someone figure out how to heal. If, for example, the free unbound cortisol looks really, really high, but the adrenal output looks like it's actually okay, you wouldn't want to treat someone for overproducing cortisol. You would want to try and figure out why they're metabolizing it so slowly, why there's so much free unbound cortisol still in the urine if the adrenals are actually producing appropriately. So that's just one example. And it's the same thing with the sex hormones. When we test like estrogen, for example, we look at all three forms of estrogen, which is estrone, estradiol, and estriol. We can also tell which pathways your body prefers to metabolize estrogen. That can especially come in handy if someone, for example, has a history of hormonally fueled cancer, not necessarily just in themselves, but like a family history. Like if you have, mothers, grandmothers, aunts with breast cancer, for example, it's really important to know how your body metabolizes estrogen, because there are dietary, lifestyle, and supplement strategies that one can follow to persuade their body, so to speak, to metabolize down a better pathway as opposed to an unhealthy pathway. The other thing that I do like about Dutch testing is, in addition to testing both the metabolized and the free hormones with cortisol, DHEA, all the sex hormones, and yes, melatonin with this one as well, the Dutch test also tests for 8 different organic acids. So it also gives us a little glimpse into a nutrient profile for you. If you are deficient or not metabolizing some of the B vitamins like B6 or B12 appropriately. It also will kind of give us an idea of you need help with like glutathione, your master antioxidant. So very, very comprehensive testing, and it is as simple as urinating on these specific little cards that you get in the kit, letting it dry for at least 24 hours, and then mailing it back to the lab. With both saliva testing and with urine testing, it usually takes a couple weeks or so to get the results back, but lots of information provided with both of those. I just feel that the Dutch test is a little more complete, but again, pros and cons to every test. So one pro of the Dutch testing is how complete it is. There's just so much information with one simple urine test. One of the negatives would be it's twice the price of saliva testing, because it is so much more comprehensive, and because of how the test has to be analyzed, how the samples have to be analyzed. But again, you're getting more information, but it is over twice as expensive. I charge $350 for that. Full retail is usually about $400. I am able to do it with just a little bit of a discount, but that's typically what it costs unless there's some kind of a special going on. Another thing is you do have to restrict fluid intake for the day that you're doing the Dutch test, because the more frequently you urinate, your urine is more diluted. And in order to appropriately measure the hormones and the metabolites, we don't want you to be dehydrated, but at the same time, we're going to restrict your fluids to no more than about 40 or so ounces in a day. So that's just something to be aware of. But I got to tell you, who should consider doing this type of test, whether it's saliva or the Dutch test? Anyone who is struggling with hormonal balance, and guess what? That's almost everyone. And especially in this year, 2020, God knows we've all seen our fair share of stress this year, right? And chronic stress really impacts your health in more ways than one. Hormones drive absolutely everything in the body. All the hormones are connected, and if there's an imbalance in one, it tends to trickle down to all of the others. So a lot of times when we see things with elevated cortisol, or cortisol that's too low, or if the cortisol and DHEA ratios don't match, or depending upon what we see with your sex hormones, we're also going to say you need to do some thyroid testing. Or we need to look at blood sugar dysregulation. There's a lot of information we can get from those tests. And one of the things that I love about testing melatonin is it gives us a glimpse into your gut function, because 25% of melatonin is produced in your pineal gland. The other 75% is actually produced in your gut. So if I see someone with deficient melatonin, not only would I expect you to tell me that you might be having problems sleeping appropriately, but I'm going to say, let's talk more about your gut health. So I'll end it there, but I just wanted to mention HPA access testing, super beneficial for a ton of people. And if you have any questions about that, drop it on the comment of this video. Talk to you later.